Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be talking through the headlines with the writer and researcher Maya Goodfellow and the Guido Fawkes reporter Tom Harwood. So a very good evening to both of you.
Good evening.
So let's take a look then at what's making the front pages. And the Times leads with Jeremy Corbyn's announcement on Question Time's debate tonight that he would remain neutral on a Brexit referendum. That story is also on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. They're saying that the Labour leader would refuse to back his own deal in a vote. The Daily Mail leads with the story about family doctors voting to scrap home GP visits, and it also has a photograph there of Prince Andrew on its front page. The Financial Times has a story about ministers risking an NHS tax breach in a bid to head off pre-poll crisis. The Guardian has a story about calls to end the use of violent sex as a murder defence following the Grace Mullane murder trial. The Eye leads with the headline Duke of Nothing and shows a photograph of Prince Andrew horse riding with the Queen. The Mirror also has this story on its front cover with the headline Sleazy Rider. And The Sun leads with the latest happenings on I'm a Celebrity. So Maya Goodfellow and Tom Harwood here with me tonight, and a bit of a selection of different stories on the front pages, but a few of them go with some of the lines that came out of tonight's Question Time with the various leaders on the BBC this evening. You picked up the Telegraph first of all, which goes with the revelation from Jeremy Corbyn about who he would back, or whether he would back anyone, should there be a second referendum. And the answer was he was going to go for a neutral stance. So what do you make of this? Maya, first of all.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot of speculation around this about what Jeremy Corbyn's position would be. And I think what he is saying is that given how deep the divides are in Britain, given that we've had such a long time of leaders taking very, very divisive positions actually on this, and given that the country doesn't agree about what should happen in terms of Brexit and what should happen next, I think it is also true that people want to feel that whoever is leading the country will enact, if there is a second referendum, whatever people vote on. So this idea of actually saying I'm going to remain neutral and I'm going to deliver what the people say, I think is actually not such a bad position, particularly when you have people like Joe Swinson going to the real extreme of saying, I'm going to revoke Article 50. What we saw in those debates tonight is even some Remainers, even some people who want to stay in the EU, think that's not a particularly democratic position. Because the Labour position is, of course, we don't like Boris Johnson's deal, so we're going to negotiate a different deal, and then we're going to put that in a referendum to the people, this new deal versus Remain. And so Jeremy Corbyn has previously not committed, has he? But tonight he said he'd be neutral. Do you think that is a fair way of putting it back to the people? Is he being an honest broker, or is it a failure of leadership, as some people are criticising?
It's about as non-committal as you can get. He was being asked for months and months what would his position be on this, and he's decided to not give an answer, to sit on the fence continually, to prolong this sort of paralysis. It's a very confusing position, and I think it will breed a lot more distrust in the political class. We've seen people who have been very disassociated with sort of the electorate and things that have been voted for over the last 3 years. And I think this will only prolong and exaggerate that sense of disassociation. I don't think it's necessarily paralysis. You don't have to agree that he should remain neutral. You can say that you think he should take a position. But this idea it would be paralysis is what Labour would say. You know, if they were to get in government come December, they would have a second referendum. That would happen. And so this idea that there would be no movement on Brexit and nothing would necessarily happen. I mean, it'd be a year of paralysis. I don't think that's actually quite accurate. Another renegotiation. And I think a lot of people, particularly in Labour voting Northern heartlands traditionally, would say, why does Leave have to win twice and Remain only have to win once to have their answer enacted?
We can kind of rehash this debate. I think it's been discussed so much. The point is that we did have that referendum. There was not a clear plan of on what terms Britain was going to leave on, and so this idea that it's just voting to leave again, I don't think is really what is happening here. And I think what is often lost in this is actually the people voted for the 2017 Parliament, in 2017 for the Parliament that then couldn't...
Where Labour said they'd enact.
Where the MPs couldn't coalesce around a deal, in part because the Prime Minister at the time, Theresa May, didn't bring people together. And so this idea that it was only MPs blocking Brexit isn't quite true in terms of what happened.
Isn't this strategy that Jeremy Corbyn's setting putting out tonight, where he sort of says he'll stand in the middle of the road, that's sort of quite a Theresa May strategy. She stood in the middle of the road, tried to deliver a deal that was sort of half in, half out, and she got hit by traffic on both sides. Jeremy Corbyn's setting him up.
And I think what Corbyn's saying is, I will remain neutral. It's not about staying in the middle of the road. It's about recognising there is so much.
Pretty middle of the road to me.
That might be how you interpret it, but there is so much division over this issue. So the country is divided on this, and people are divided about what should happen next. And so this idea that politicians must say this is what should happen in terms of what happens with Brexit ignores the fact that people can vote on this again.
But before we move on to another paper, just to pick up the point that the Telegraph is trying to make there, Corbyn would refuse to back his own deal in Brexit vote. Is that a difficult position for him to go to Europe, thrash out a deal, to say to people, this is a really good deal, but I'm not going to back it, I'm going to be neutral? Does that make it hard?
I think this is actually like a misreading of what happens. You hear so much talk about leadership, and sometimes actually leadership is also listening to what people want to happen in terms of living in a democracy, and the fact that the original referendum was something people voted on. If you have another referendum, that is going to be decided on by the people. But this idea, obviously the Telegraph is going to talk about it in these terms, but I think this idea that he wouldn't be backing his own deal ignores the fact that if the Labour Party renegotiate a deal, they know that is going to go to the people. So this idea that they won't negotiate well or they won't be able to get a good deal, they know is going to be put to the people. Britain might leave on those terms, and the EU knows that too. OK,
let's move on to the Times. They've got a similar headline. They certainly go with this line that came out of the debate, Corbyn neutral on Brexit. I mean, to some extent, does this help Jeremy Corbyn? He's been criticised a lot for not saying whether he campaigned for Leave or Remain. You may not like his answer, but he's got an answer now. Does that mean that he's going to stop being asked continuously, which was causing him a few headaches, wasn't it?
That's right. There was an Evening Standard interview yesterday where Jeremy Corbyn was asked the question, Leave or Remain, and he said both. And I think he's really continued that in today with this. This is the only real news line, I think, that came out of those Question Time interviews tonight. And I'm not sure that it will really have settled any of his critics, who can still put forward the same attack lines that we've been hearing for the last few weeks and months. That is, this is a man who can't make up his mind.
OK, you say it's the only news line, but we've got a double-page spread of the Times, which might disagree with you, because this is all devoted, I think, pretty much the whole page, the whole double-page spread at least, to that debate. So what else can you pick out from here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this headline is quite interesting. You know, don't blame me for austerity, Johnson tells hecklers. And what this does tell us is it's not that Jeremy Corbyn's position on Brexit is not the only news story from the debates tonight. What we saw was, I think, an incredibly painful half hour for Jo Swinson, when she was really put under the microscope in terms of her record of voting for all kinds of austerity measures like the bedroom tax, and wasn't
when
really...
they were in coalition, you mean?
Exactly, and she wasn't really able to give a very good answer on that. And I think there was a sense of distrust from the audience there. But I also think Boris Johnson did come under a lot of scrutiny, a lot of fire. Even this idea that they would end austerity. If you actually look at the figures, for instance, what they're proposing on schools, it doesn't amount to reversing austerity. What it amounts to is reversing to 2009 spending levels, which would amount actually to a 13-year real terms average freeze by 2022. So I think for some voters, this idea that the Conservatives are now saying we're going to invest and, you know, trust us to look after the NHS, trust us to look after public services, isn't going to have much truck with people who know that they've been experiencing real decimation of those public services.
What do you make on this of this spending issue? I mean, Maya suggesting that the Tories won't be trusted; they're not putting enough resources in. Do you think that's fair, or do you think?
Well, I think we need to look at it.
Putting too much money in?
Right, we need to look at it in context. In 2009-10, the government was borrowing £1 for every £4 it spent. 25% of government expenditure was borrowing. That's now down to less than 1 out of every £40 that's being spent. So obviously now there's more capacity to put money in, but that simply wasn't the case at the beginning of this decade. There wasn't the money there. We had a deficit that was higher proportionally than Greece. That was the financial reality that this country faced. And I think it's totally reasonable to assess in different times, in different financial and economic realities, you do different things to the economy. Now the economy is 30% bigger than it was at the beginning of the decade. There is that room to invest. I
mean, I think it's good to borrow to invest, actually, and I think that this is...
Borrowing 25% of expenditure?
This is actually a misreading of what has happened in the past 9 years, if not longer. Private household debt has exploded over the past 9 years, and that is often the missed understanding of this story, is where people have really felt the burdens in terms of having to take on that debt. But what is also interesting about the way this is talked about in terms of borrowing to invest and investing in our economy. One is it ignores that when you invest, you create jobs, people have more spending power, and they put money back into the economy, which hasn't happened over the past 9 years. And it also ignores that our levels of state spending, even under Labour's plans, would be around the level that it is for countries like France and Norway.
That's
so this idea that it's radical or it's very extreme totally ignores that the UK has been out of step with Europe.
Absolutely. The Jeremy Corbyn plan has a billions-wide black hole right in the middle of that budget. That's either going to come out through extraordinarily more borrowing, or it will hike taxes on the people that Labour are promising to not hike taxes on. I think the latter is probably more likely. It will mean that ordinary working people will see their taxes shoot up, and that will be incredibly damaging for our economy's prospects.
OK, I'm going to move us on only because we've got another double-page spread in The Sun. I think you've seen this. I wasn't expecting it, but we have got another double-page spread. So The Sun, as you might imagine, critical of Jeremy Corbyn's performance there. Tragic grandpa, they call him there. They say Corbyn rattled by audience fury.
Yeah, I mean, this is particularly picking up on one member of the audience who said, I don't buy this sort of cuddly magic grandpa act that I think has been presented a lot about Jeremy Corbyn. This was a man who was talking about his daughters and how he feared for them under a Labour government because of the way that particularly Jewish female MPs within the Labour Party have been treated under Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually all of the people who went before that audience tonight had these moments where they were really put under fire from audience members. So if you think about Boris Johnson being questioned about his absolutely abhorrent comments about women who wear the burqa and the veil, also his comments about, I mean, there were...
He was defending the right of women to wear whatever they want.
I mean, to compare women to letterboxes, I think is absolutely...
That's not what he was doing.
It's absolutely... I mean, that's literally what he did.
He used the word to talk about a piece of clothing.
Yeah, I mean,
that's totally legitimate.
If you want to defend it, then fine. But the point is that he did come under fire for those comments from audience members. So I think each of these leaders, rightly so, were scrutinised by the public. And these were moments where we saw them having to defend, whether you agree with the defence or not, these past moves in their career.
And would you say that different newspapers are going to take a different angle on how each leader fared?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that it was a ferocious audience this evening that absolutely tore into every leader. I think some fared better than others. I think Joe Swinson, I would agree, came under a huge barrage of attack, and so did Jeremy Corbyn, really over everything from anti-Semitism, the party's being investigated by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the only party other than the BNP to ever be investigated. That was a poignant moment tonight. But I think leaders like Nicola Sturgeon and Boris Johnson actually were able to sort of withstand that a lot more than some of the other leaders tonight.
OK, and you may not agree with that, I suspect.
I mean, I don't agree that Boris Johnson didn't come under extreme scrutiny for his record on austerity, but...
OK. And let's, finally, if we can just squeeze it in, I think we've only got a minute or so, but the front page of the Financial Times was another story you wanted to touch on. The headline there, Ministers risk NHS tax breach in bid to head off pre-poll crisis.
Yeah, so this is really Matt Hancock, who is the Health Secretary, has signed off on this emergency package of pension reforms, and the attempt is really to incentivise high-earning doctors to work extra shifts. But it's interesting in this story is what it says is that how effective is this going to be, and what does this mean in terms of what the Conservatives are trying to do ahead of this general election or during this general election. So a lot of people are concerned about the NHS, and I think because the Conservatives have been in government for 9 years, they've been overseeing things like the NHS, and so this is an attempt to really try and gain some form of credibility on this very, very key election issue.
And I mean, the reality with this particular quirk of the tax system, of our incredibly complicated, burdensome tax system, is that doctors, if they work more, they'll earn less money because of the way that the tax bans, and particularly with regard to pensions, fall in. So this is saying that the government will take action to reverse that quirk, to allow doctors to earn more if they work more, which seems elementary. I'm amazed it hasn't happened before.
OK, on that note, we're going to take a pause. Don't go anywhere. Coming up after the break, the Queen's public show of support as she rides out the storm with Prince Andrew. We've got more on that in a moment.
Britain's Prince Charles and his wife Camilla have visited New Zealand's Christchurch, where they were greeted by students and attended a ceremony with Muslim community members. The Prince of Wales praised the people of Christchurch for their dignity and their responses to the March the 15th terror attacks before visiting Lincoln University, where he gave a State of the Environment speech and viewed student projects.
The worst of times, it seems to me, can so often bring out the very best in us all. In the wake of the terrible events of the 15th of March, we have seen many examples of this, as all the communities of Christchurch have stood proudly with their Muslim brothers and sisters.
A Philippine Airlines jet with flames coming from one engine has returned safely to Los Angeles International Airport shortly after takeoff. The Boeing 777 bound for Manila reported a problem with the right engine. It turned around and landed safely. A 1939 comic book that introduced Marvel characters for the first time has sold for a record $1.26 million at auction in the US. Marvel Comics #1 features the first appearances of characters including Human Torch and the Submariner. Decades later, Marvel debuted Spider-Man and the Incredible Hulk and other superheroes that have headlined recent blockbuster movies. And Tesla has unveiled its first ever pickup truck, a long-awaited expansion to its product line that poses a direct challenge to Detroit automakers. With a starting price of $39,900, the Cybertruck is less expensive than initially flagged. Production is expected to begin around late 2021.
Our planet never ceases to amaze us. The best is always waiting to be discovered. Every corner hides unseen treasures that leave you spellbound. Be the first to witness a land of fascinating journeys. Where in the world could this be? Saudi, welcome to Arabia. Get your visa now.
Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me tonight, my good fellow Tom Harwood. We're going to take a look at the front page of The Guardian next, because in the aftermath of a guilty verdict in the case of the murder of Grace Mullane in New Zealand, awful case, they are throwing up an area of discussion on the front page of The Guardian, aren't they? Calls to end use of violent sex as a murder defence.
Yeah, in this story, what it says is that researchers have found that there's been a tenfold rise in the past 2 decades in the number of times like similar arguments have been made in court when people have been murdered in this way. And so the argument that's being made here by campaigners is that increasingly there is this growing trend of attackers to allege that strangulation or injuries inflicted on women were inadvertently caused by some kind of sexual games. And so this is really a push to say this kind of defence should not be it should not be framed in this way.
It's such a difficult area because, of course, you don't ever want to shut down a part of the legal system, and you can imagine some cases where it might be legitimate almost, but it does seem that the tenfold rise can't be a naturalistic thing. We're not becoming a society that moves in that way. So it seems that there is some legitimacy to this call here, but I think any sort of big sledgehammer legislation type move risks catching people out at either end, and so it's something that needs to be looked at very, very carefully.
Yeah, and interesting at least that it's on a front page, and we'll start a discussion about it and more awareness at least, I guess. Let's move on to the front page of The Eye next, because once again Prince Andrew is making front page headlines.
Yes.
I mean, how many days on from his interview last Saturday night?
It seems like the interview was designed to put to bed all of these questions, and all it has done is opened up a Pandora's box of scandal and controversy. And today we see sort of very mixed messages from Buckingham Palace. First, this photo that's on a number of front pages this evening of the Queen going riding with her son in an almost show of solidarity.
That's certainly how it's been interpreted, isn't it? I suppose we don't know that she was aware that she might be photographed.
It's unlikely that this
was.
sort of thing makes its way out into the press organically. And so there are sort of whispers that this was an orchestrated attempt. But at the same time, Prince Andrew's private office is being moved out of Buckingham Palace. And so there's this severance going on at the same time as this show of solidarity. And it's very mixed messages coming out of the royal family right now. It seems like they're a very confused organisation.
Do you think that's right? Do you think it's a way of saying the royal family as an organisation is saying, Andrew, step aside, but this is a woman with her son feeling that he's going through a tough time and she's showing a kind of personal solidarity?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things still. I still think whenever this is on the front pages, I'm just reminded by how awful that interview was, not only because it was so badly handled, but actually more so because there just seemed to be such little consideration for the girls that have been the victims in this whole case. It just seemed to be so much about him. And so I think it hasn't been a particularly good look for the royal family. You know, as a Republican, I think it's quite interesting that we're talking about the royal family in this way and really scrutinising some of their actions. And I think it's quite interesting if this has been some kind of orchestrated PR stunt on the behalf of the Queen to have done it, why that is, if they want to maintain this image and not be this source of controversy. And they definitely don't want to be this kind of source of controversy during a general election. I don't think they want to be pushing election stories off front pages and concentrating them in the spotlight in this way. So I think it is interesting that it's happening at this time in this way.
That's right. I'm just going to bring in one more front page, a front page of the Daily Mirror as well. Sleazy rider is their headline with the same photograph again. And it's true that different political candidates are being asked about their views on Prince Andrew.
Right, and it's opened up this question over, I mean, Jeremy Corbyn's long-standing anti-royal attitude is now at the fray as well, but I think this just shows what a poor decision that Newsnight interview was. And the royal family is best when they're not political, when they don't try and put themselves in the fray. And I think all that interview did was put themselves in that political fray. And like all of the best institutions of this country, whether it's the royal family, whether it's the church, whether it's the judiciary, all are best when they stay outside of politics and when they start getting involved, as we've seen actually from all of those institutions over the last few months. That raises really tricky questions.
OK, and the other development they have on the front page there, that Barclays, Royal Philharmonic and National Ballet have also dissociated themselves from Prince Andrew, so the news keeps on coming on that. We are out of time, but I'm going to see you both again at 11:30 for the moment. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.